Thank you so much. So I'm going to kick off this series. And I think in order to set the stage here, I want to actually provide a brief agenda of what I'm going to be talking about. So first of all, I think it's worth introducing Apollo Health Ventures because we do have a very unique approach to not just venture creation, but also in general, our investment focus. Then I'm going to be speaking specifically about the venture creation process as Apollo Health, and then I'm going to provide a brief case example for a company that we have created with this process. So starting with the introduction, as Kevin already mentioned in his introduction, we are actually very focused on, and our mission is enhancing healthy lifespans. That means that we are developing therapeutics or interventions that have the potential to prevent or reverse age-related diseases and thereby extend healthy human lifespans. So we usually start with moonshot visions of how we could target such diseases and processes, but then we really go into developing or conceptualizing really science-driven concepts, and then apply our company building expertise and very importantly, a feasible development strategy. And I'll be talking about why this is so important in a little bit. But basically, you can see here our wheel of aging mechanisms that are crucial for health and are usually disrupted during aging and may be targeted to prevent or reverse age-related diseases. Briefly about our footprint, actually, so Apollo is headquartered in Berlin in Germany, but we have an office in Boston. And when you look at the green dots here, this is where our scientific co-founders' investments are located. So it's pretty much the opposite of what you would normally see for a traditional venture group. We are very location agnostic. We're not focusing on the traditional biotech hubs, really looking at where we can find the most compelling science. And I'm going to be talking about the process of how we identify the science in a little bit. The other question that may come up is why aging? So why are we interested in targeting aging? Because a lot of people would say aging is not a disease. It is very heterogeneous. People would think it's not malleable. It is inevitable. And on top of that, there's also no feasible clinical endpoint if you wanted to change aging. So I think in terms of these common arguments that we usually are confronted with, even though aging is not a disease, it is the primary risk factor for several major diseases. And we can see how the risk of dying from a specific disease exponentially increases with aging. And so the hypothesis is that the damage actually builds up in the body from a much earlier time. And this damage is basically driven by the processes that I showed earlier in this wheel. And the goal here really is to identify these damages and target them earlier before the disease can manifest. The other comment that we hear a lot is that aging is very, very heterogeneous, and that's true. And that also shows when you look at the age population, that actually shows a big share of multimorbidity. And that's really difficult to treat. So once multimorbidity has established, then this will result in the need for polypharmacy, and that comes with other issues. So that's actually what we want to avoid. And it seems like over the next years, this is going to be increasing. So the other comment is that aging is not malleable, but actually we have seen, and this was shown already in, I guess, when was that? 1960s or so, that just by feeding these are different mice, and they're fed different diets. And you're looking at a Kaplan-Meier curve, basically looking at when these mice were dying. And you see that the control mice, which is this, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but this the very earliest dying mice, they are being fed a normal diet, but then as you change a diet to a more and more restricted diet, these mice actually live a lot longer. So just simple dietary restriction can delay aging significantly in mice. So that is actually pretty striking. But until a couple of, almost 30 years ago, people didn't really understand how this works. And then, I mean, also they have shown this in monkeys. So even in monkeys, you can see that calorie restriction has extended their survival by quite significantly. And then in 1993, it was the first time that someone has generated a mutant. So basically just a single gene mutant that doubled the lifespan of a worm. So this was work by Cynthia Kenyon. And she showed that by modulating or by mutating the insulin receptor, so DAF2 is actually the insulin receptor, these worms were living twice as long. But then again, if they mutated another gene, DAF16, which is in this slide here, the FOXO gene, then this lifespan extension was reversed. So this was the first time that someone really showed that by modulating a single gene, you can affect aging and extend lifespan. In the meantime, since then, several interventions have actually been shown to extend lifespan. So there were not just calorie restriction and also rapamycin, but then also senescent cell clearance, growth hormone receptor knockouts, and more recently, partial reprogramming. And when you look at these animals, you see how they actually are looking much healthier and looking less frail when you're treating them with such interventions. So I'm mentioning here rapamycin, which is actually a known drug. And rapamycin was actually the very first drug that was shown to extend lifespan, not just in mice, but really across several different species. So rapamycin was tested in what is called the NIA Interventions Testing Program, where they actually have 3 different sites, and they have several hundred mice per study at these across these different sites. Both males and females, and then they feed these mice different drugs, and they have repeatedly shown that rapamycin can extend lifespan, whether it's given early or late in life, and it actually has been shown to have a dose-dependent effect on lifespan, as you can see in this on the right image. So rapamycin was kind of the first real drug that really captured the attention of actually, it's not true. I'm going to talk about another one, but this one that was the first that really has shown to extend lifespan. And that's why with Apollo, we were really interested in developing such rapamycin analogs. So we have one of our first investments was actually in a company called AEOVIAN Pharmaceuticals, which we also helped to build. And they have developed a rapamycin analog that is highly selective for the mTORC complex 1. I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's thought that this is what you want to make sure that your drug is safe. We have raised 37 million Series A for this company, together with Sofinnova and Bio in the Bay Area. So there are, and I actually don't want to dismiss another company that was formed way before, actually, that was targeting sirtuins, and we also know that sirtuins play a role in aging and the stress response, particularly via very different mechanisms. And around, the mid 2000s, or even early 2000s, scientists, and specifically David Sinclair at Harvard Medical School, has identified these SIRTRIS activating compounds, basically based on resveratrol. And a company was founded around that called SIRTRIS, which was then sold to GSK for $720 million. So that happened already 2008 or 2009. So that was probably the first big example of these new aging drugs that have attracted interest. But since then, actually, we've also seen Google and ABBVIE invest billions into aging research. So we look at that. That happened 2014 is when they started this research collaboration called Calico, which is 30 years after the first gene was discovered. But at least finally there is more attention going towards this space, and especially more funding. And just this year, they have announced that they are extending their funding for this research collaboration, and it's actually a pretty big endeavor. So just wanted to give some context to why Apollo is so interested in building companies in this space and investing in companies in this space. So right now, the status is that with Apollo, we have built a diversified portfolio targeting several different mechanisms of aging. And I'm showing our wheel here again with different companies that we started. I mean, I'm not putting in the names here right now, but there are some of them that are already in our portfolio. Some of them are currently still in our deal flow. Some are ventures that we created, and some are still venture labs project that we are still creating right now. And that brings me to our next topic, which is the venture creation process at Apollo. I want to give an overview of how this process actually is structured. And then I'm going to explain how this actually works. So the structure is really based initially on the selection of a topic. I mentioned a couple of topics before, but we constantly screen the field and identify new topics of interest that's really driven by the scientific rigor behind those projects or topics, and also the potential impact that can be made by targeting this science. The next step, once we have identified a topic that we want to focus on, is exploration. So that means that we're looking at several different publications that are available, maybe certain grants that have been applied for. We attend conferences, or we screen conferences to identify new ideas of how we can build something around the specific topic. In the next stage, after we have explored the field and also talked to a couple of people, or actually several people. This is really mainly talking to a lot of people who have been working on these topics. We come up with the idea. So this is the ideation stage, where we develop a hypothesis of what we think we can do in this space, what a feasible approach would look like. And then comes the most interesting part from my perspective is really it's an iterative process. So we develop our first hypothesis, but that usually doesn't remain our last hypothesis. So that gets iterated several times by talking to our team initially, then getting feedback, talking to our scientific advisors, getting feedback, talking to KOLs, designing a killer experiment, and then getting feedback on that. So that's getting us to refine the concept. And then the conceptualization step is really on defining what the R&D plan and the budget would actually look like for this venture. What are the key milestones? What would the IP strategy look like? And who are the partners who we would be working with? And once that is defined, and sometimes even in parallel, we found the company, and that is probably my least favorite part, because it is a lot of paperwork, but it's extremely important. So don't underestimate this part. It's really setting the company up with the legal framework and all the agreements and licenses that are required. And then in the last stage, it's actually the building of the company by actually providing funding. I mean, in this case, it's really coming primarily from Apollo, sometimes from co-investors as well. Providing the strategy for the company, helping with operations, and very importantly, recruiting. So when we're looking at selecting a focus area, we really start with blue sky ideas and really look at what has been happening in science, what caught our interest. It's usually brainstorming sessions with the team where we identify new areas that people are excited about, and then start working on it. So I'm listing here a couple of examples to have an idea of the topics that generally would be interesting to us. Some of these we have already invested in, some of these we're currently building, and some of these are still topics that we're interested in exploring further. And there is a long list of other topics, which I didn't want to overwhelm people, but it's, I mean, the easiest one would be fasting, sleep, and exercise, like understanding how that actually drives health. But then there are a lot of other things that are pretty exciting, like cellular reprogramming, which seems to be a very very powerful way of targeting a lot of the age-related processes, and then targeting senescence, which I showed earlier, the picture of the 2 mice, and that was actually a senescence targeting intervention that led to this difference in these mice. So once we selected one focus area, and this is usually driven by one person in our team that really leads and owns a program, then we go to the next stage of exploration. And the easiest ones to leverage for this exploration part is really PubMed and maybe the grants that you can find. The literature is not limited to the aging journals, actually, because a lot of this literature is also published in other journals, but these are the journals that regularly publish on topics that target or that affect aging and are relevant for us. And then there are also a lot of conferences, the Gordon's Conference, Keystone, Cold Spring Harbor, and Cell Symposia that are specifically focused on aging and actually cover a very broad scope on different aspects of aging, different mechanisms usually. So it provides a really nice overview of the different topics. So once we have explored this focus area, we try to really develop our ideas. And this starts usually with general understanding of the pathways. I'm showing the insulin signaling pathway here as an example. And really understanding how this pathway actually works and what the key targets are in this pathway. And here I'm actually narrowing down on mTOR. So that target that I'm showing here, and I don't know if anyone would recognize this. This is actually the mTOR protein, and then from the targets, we try to identify which modalities are most feasible to actually modulate those targets. And this could be, there's a really wide option space in terms of modalities. You could develop small molecules, which is probably the most straightforward, although not always as easy, because there are also undruggable targets where you probably need a different approach. There are peptides, there are RNA therapeutics, there are gene therapies, there are proteins. So there are a couple of ways how you can modulate your target depending on various different things of how the target itself is regulated and how easy it is to drug with a small molecule. In general, the easiest approach is a small molecule, because then you can you can optimize the molecule, and it's not like delivery is usually not an issue, whereas with some of the other modalities, delivery is something that you also need to consider. But then there are a couple of other considerations in case you're targeting a very specific tissue and delivery is not an issue for that tissue, then that makes it easier to use some of the other modalities as well. But I don't want to get too much into this. This is basically just an overview of how we actually come up with our ideas. And then I want to show how the iterative process looks like. So basically, usually there is a development, actually starts with a rough development of a proposal. In this proposal, we lay out the scientific rationale and the proposed strategy for this specific idea. In the proposal, we also define milestones that we want to meet with this proposal, which could be either an efficacy readout or a filing of IP, if we can generate novel IP. And then matching these milestones, we draft an R&D plan. And in this R&D plan, we either have a killer experiment, which basically gives us the efficacy readout, or a plan to identify and develop a novel IP. This plan is then, together with the milestone of the proposals, presented to the team and also to our scientific partners that we identified. And we obtained feedback on whether this plan makes sense, whether we have missed anything, whether there's something else we still need to consider. And then after we obtain feedback, we also consult with some KOLs, either people who have they already worked in industry on similar targets or on similar pathways. People have developed drugs in the clinic and have an idea of what a target product profile would have to look like if you want to develop a drug for a specific disease. And of course, also checking in with an IP counsel to make sure that our IP strategy makes sense. The cycle sometimes, the iterations sometimes get repeated several times until we actually finally come up with a plan that is whole and is feasible. And that brings us then to our concept. So the concept, as I laid out before, is based on the milestones that we define. And this is really important because when we're doing venture creation, we're defining go, no-go milestones where we can make decisions of whether we want to continue with this project or whether we need to reassess and maybe change strategies or change something else in the plan. So we have those milestones, then we have, of course, IP strategy. Since we're working, and I think in general, it's important to have both the US and the European angles. We have also IP councils from different areas that we work with depending on where our companies are located, and sometimes either way, location doesn't make a difference usually. Then we work with several partners or collaborators. That these could either be institutions or they can be CROs. So here I'm listing just some of the largest CROs: EVOTech, Charles River, WuXi AppTech. We've been working with those CROs, but we've also been working with other CROs. Really depends on what the expertise is that we need. And then we develop our R&D plan and budget. And I've shown an empty template here of what this would look like. I mean, of course, this is not what a real plan or timeline would look like. This would be more staggered. but this is kind of like the empty template that we use to develop that. And then once we have all of that figured out, and sometimes even already in parallel, we start with the foundation of the company. So this I mentioned are probably the least exciting for me personally, but I think the most important for actually the success of the company. I mean, besides the science, of course, but I think there are a lot of things that can go wrong, and I would not recommend anyone try to do that by themselves, but really always have an experienced law firm or advisor who can help with this, because that is basically your contract for developing this, or for building this company, and working together with your co-founders or institutions, and you want to make sure that everything is covered properly, and all of the agreements are such that future investors in this company will not see any red flags. And that happens sometimes. There are some things that people want to build into these agreements that later on investors may not like, and which may be prohibitive for follow-on investments. So importantly, of course, this would be the shareholder agreement. This is really what you're putting together with your co-founders, also the scientific co-founder, and potentially the institution, depends. Then also the collaboration or consulting agreements, again, with your scientific co-founder and or usually also the institution. Really important is also the IP license. If there is IP that you want to license and bring into your company, this is something that needs to be negotiated with institutions, and this can vary a lot. There are a lot of different mindsets at institutions that are working with or that are licensing IP, and there can be a wide range of terms that are being considered appropriate. And then really importantly, for most of the projects that we're working on are the sponsored research agreements. And there it's also really important to make sure that certain terms are really well defined, especially when it comes to IP ownership. When you're running experiments at an institution, this has to be clarified: who's going to be owning this IP, who has the option, or what are the terms to license this IP in case it's a joint ownership. So there are a couple of things that need to be considered. And then once these things are all settled and the company can finally start, then of course you have to think about how you're building the company. One of the important things, and of course this is covered right in the beginning when we start a company, is the funding. So we bring in the initial funds to get the initial work, the R&D plan that we lay out, and the operations funded, and also make sure that in the meantime, if someone else is interested in such a topic, that we may even bring in a co-investor. Then we are helping with the strategy of the company and refining that. Of course, initially it's an R&D plan, but you always want to think ahead and make sure that everything is in place once new data arrives, making sure you're filing this IP, making sure the next steps of the R&D are defined, or maybe potential changes are being made. And then of course thinking about which clinical applications and which clinical strategy you want to go for. And then operations is usually something that is really crucial, but it's also sometimes a bit burdensome for someone who is mostly interested in the scientific part of the company. So usually initially we help with that in our companies, but then we try to find people who we can bring in. And this brings me to the last step. It's the HR. really finding the right talent for a company is probably the most important. And I think it's really crucial for everyone to understand what they can and what they cannot do, because I think we're all very ambitious and we all want to learn and want to build something, but sometimes it helps to surround yourself with the right expertise and bring in the right expertise from outside. And so I want to give a lot of credit to my colleague Ole, and you can reach out to him as well if you have any questions. He's really leading our recruiting for both Apollo and our portfolio companies, because there is actually a lot of recruiting happening, and it's probably one of the most important parts of venture creation, and really thinking about the talent that you need, and that will help you get your company up to success. So the way we are building our companies is usually together with our core team members. So we have a venture fellow, and Kevin kindly already introduced me, but Kevin basically works at Apollo as one of our venture fellows, or what I like to call them, entrepreneurs. So these are brilliant scientists with an entrepreneurial mindset. So for these colleagues, it's usually that they're coming from a scientific background. They have an entrepreneurial drive. They come with creative ideas and a very proactive approach to actually trying to translate these ideas. And what happens is that they, as I mentioned before, they're really leading and owning one main project. But at the same time, they can be members on teams for other projects as well, to kind of also have a little bit of exposure to some other ideas and cross-fertilize. While they are building this one main project, they also have access to our portfolio expertise. So sometimes we may have one expert in one of the portfolio companies that they can reach out to and ask certain questions about their own project. And that usually works out pretty nicely. And then, of course, they are supported by the Apollo team, because we don't expect everyone to know everything from the start. So the Apollo team is always there to make sure everything is covered and all the resources are available. And then we also have venture partners or executives that we bring in. And these are usually people who are coming from biotech or pharma, have been in management or leadership roles before. They have a strong venture and corporate network. They're passionate about impact that we can make with our companies and want to be part of that. And they are also willing to be really hands-on in those early stage companies, because, to be honest, I mean, you have to be aware that a company creation or a company that was just created, a role in that company will be much more hands-on than in a more mature company. And these colleagues, they are usually managing our new ventures. They're really helping with all of these aspects with operations and strategy. Also involved in recruiting, of course, with support from Apollo. They're leading the business development and also the fundraising for their projects, although also with support from Apollo, of course. And yeah, so that brings me now to the last section of this presentation, which is our case example with Samsara Therapeutics. So I mentioned before that we really always try to identify an interesting area or an interesting topic. And so Samsara was our very first venture creation. So we tried to identify the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to aging and longevity. And this was the process of autophagy. So I think a lot of people are aware that in 2016, the Nobel Prize was awarded for the discoveries in the mechanisms of autophagy. But also when we're thinking about the different things that I mentioned, calorie restriction, also exercise, rapamycin that I mentioned before, all of these are inducing autophagy. And it seems like autophagy is really essential for driving or maintaining healthy longevity or health. So what we did is, when we identified autophagy as one of the most interesting areas, or most low-hanging fruits really in the health or longevity space, we looked at a lot of different publications in that space. Who has been working on autophagy and has been working on aging, the role of autophagy in aging and longevity. And really, two scientists stood out. So I'm showing a couple of publications that they published together, and they really were focusing a lot on the mechanisms of how autophagy mediates health span, but also on identifying molecules that could induce autophagy. So these were Guido Krimmer at the University of Paris and Frank Matteo at the University of Graz in Austria. And when we were looking at how we can actually build a company in that space, looked at some of their publications. So one of them was the induction of autophagy by the molecule spermidine. Spermidine is a natural compound. It's actually produced by our own bodies, but it's also contained in food. And that seems to be very, very strong data that they had generated, although with spermidine, you need a very high amount of spermidine to actually get that effect. Another publication came out about a flavonoid compound that also promotes autophagy and was very, very potent, although also came with some challenges in terms of drug development. And then there's also a general discovery platform that they actually use to identify this compound, that they use to identify generally induction or activators of autophagy. And so we went ahead with the idea that we could use this platform to identify novel autophagy activators. So this platform is basically a really like state-of-the-art, high throughput, automated imaging platform where you have a cell-based readout of autophagy induction, and then identify hits from several tens of thousands of molecules that were screened here per week or per month. And then at the same time, we would work with a validation system where we will look at cellular health and validate the compounds that are activating autophagy to make sure that they're not activating autophagy because they're toxic, but really because they are inducing a healthy response in the cells. Here we were also working, of course, we're working with the universities, University of Paris and University of Graz, but also in terms of medicinal chemistry with Evotech and with WuXi. And when we are now moving to the building part, we also put together the management team. This is Jens Eckstein from Apollo, who's interim CEO while we were building the company. We have Peter Hamley, who was formerly the global head of external innovation at Sanofi, and we brought him on board as our CSO, Warren Galloway as a head of chemistry, and John Beckman as a head of biology. And over the past 2 years, the pipeline has really matured to now. I think this image is actually outdated. I took this from the website because we have a newer one, but I'm not sure whether this is already available for public disclosure. So I'm showing this on the website right now, but these compounds are a bit closer to the clinic as what you can see here on this image. And I mean, in summary, for Apollo, this is really how it fits into our strategy. We're targeting several of these different hallmarks of aging or mechanisms of aging. With Samsara, we actually have built the largest discovery and development platform for novel autophagy activators. And as we were building Samsara, there were also a couple of new companies that were coming up. This was Caraway, Cosmo Therapeutics, and Libra Therapeutics. And also recently, there was an acquisition of called Porter Therapeutics by Merck for autophagy boosting molecules. There was a deal of 576 million US dollars, at least up to, I don't know how much the upfront payment was. But yeah, so I wanted to summarize again that we at Apollo are always hiring for both the venture fellow roles, the venture partner roles, but also other roles that could be relevant for our portfolios. So if you're interested in working with us, you can reach out to my lovely colleague, Ole, who is our head of HR at Apollo, and would be happy to receive your notes.